for this painting, I have my canvas and I'm going to be painting in portrait today. I have my palette with my paints in. Over here, I've got a kitchen towel just to dab my brushes on. I have 3 different sized paintbrushes, a square shaped flat end brush, a smaller pointy one, and then a tiny little pointy one. I've then got a jar of water, and over here in my palette, I have my paints. So I'm going to be using white, purple, pink, yellow and black today for my painting, but feel free to change up your colours depending on what you want to do for your own masterpiece. We're going to start by focusing on the background, which is going to be our sky. So I'm going to go for these lovely pastel tones for this painting. I'm going to start with more pastel purples, blending down into some pinks, and then eventually down into some peach shades. So to start with, I'm just going to pick up my bigger brush, and I'd recommend just dipping it in the water, just to loosen up the bristles. You can also give it a dab on your kitchen towel. And then moving over to my palette, I'm just going to spend a moment mixing up my first colour. So this is going to be the shade that I'm going to have for the top of my sky. So the reason why I'm sticking to the sort of purpley hues for the top section is I want this to sort of be the very, very first signs of nightfall. So I want the colours to be slightly cooler in shade and then blending down into these more sunset, warmer colours. So I'm just going to start by picking up a dollop of white paint and moving it over to a spare area in my palette. And I'm just going to gradually add a tiny little bit of purple at a time. The purple that I'm using here is quite pigmented and quite dark, so you just need a small amount so that you can control the colour that you're making. Remember, it's totally up to you what colours you use, how dark you want them, how bright, how pastel in shade. If you want them more pastel, you just add more white, and if you want them slightly brighter, then you just need to add more of the actual colour. So once you're happy with your shade, I would recommend just adding a few drops of water into the paint. Because we're using acrylic paint today, it's nice just to add in the water to keep the paint nice and fluid for when we use it. So moving back over to my canvas, this is the fun bit, because we're now just going to paint the top section of our canvas with this colour. Now it's up to you what application you want to do with the paint. I feel like it's a little bit personal preference. Sometimes it depends what mood you're in. You might want to be nice and smooth and just drag the paintbrush backwards and forwards all the way across the canvas, or you might like to be a little bit more choppy with your movements. It's totally up to you. You can even try both if you want to and see which one you prefer. I would also say if you are painting a canvas, you might want to wrap the paint around the sides and the top and the bottom as well as you go, just so when the painting is displayed, it's all covered up from every angle that you look at it. So I'm just going to bring this colour down a little bit more because I'm going to blend my next shade up into it. So I want to make sure that I'm still seeing some of this light purple at the very top of my canvas and that I don't lose any of it. What you can also start doing now while the paint underneath is still wet is you can, if you want to, introduce a little bit of this pure purple. And because the paint underneath is still wet, you can actually just work it into the canvas and it will create these lovely strokes and streaks in your sky. The great thing about painting the sky is it's extremely therapeutic and calming. And whenever you look at the sky or photos of the sky or references, it never looks the same. There's always different tones, different movement within there. So I always think it's quite nice to experiment with adding a few different shades into your sky, streaking them in. Because if you don't like it, you can just spend a moment blending it out. But I quite like seeing these different tones within the sky. You can even experiment with picking up a little bit of white on your brush and blending that in. I think the trick is here is not pushing down too heavily with your hand. The lighter you push, the softer the brush strokes are going to be. And then if you don't like something, the heavier you push, the more it's going to blend it out into the colour underneath. So just spend a moment enjoying this part. Sometimes with the sky you can overthink it. Try not to overthink it. Try just to let your hand do whatever it wants to do. Because really you cannot go wrong when you're painting the sky. I'm just picking up some of this lilac colour that I used to start with, and I'm just adding a little bit more of it just underneath here. This is going to act as a base for our next shade. Again, just remember to paint the sides as you go. So what I want to do now is I want to start introducing a little bit of pink tones into the purple. So I'm actually just going to pick up a small amount of this lilac shade that I've already made, moving it over to a different dish in my palette. I'm then going to pick up a tiny little bit of pink. Now, if you haven't got pink paint, don't worry, you can always add a tiny little bit of red to this and you'll get a pink colour. So by mixing that pink in with that lilac, I've still got a purple undertone, but it's starting to warm the paint up slightly, so I can see the slight difference between the lilac here and the pink here. So with this new shade, I'm just going to paint it on top of that last section, the section that we already applied as our base. Again, I'm still just using quite choppy motions with my paintbrush, and I'm going to bring this down as well. Essentially, we're just going to do exactly the same thing as we just did with the purple at the top. And don't worry if your colours blend a little bit. We want this to happen. We want to get a sort of graduated tone. So what you can do is then do a little dance between your colours. So I'm going to pick up a bit more of my lilac. Start adding that in just over the top of the pink. And then I could pick up a little bit of more of the pinky tone and add swoops of it up into the lilac shade. So we're just trying to blend out those two colours just to make them merge together. What you can then start to experiment with is picking up a little bit of lilac, adding that over the pink. You can even pick up some pure pink and start streaking that in to the sky as well. So the trick is working fairly quickly just so that the paint underneath stays wet. That's when we're going to get these lovely blended tones with our sky. Again, you can pick up some white if you'd like to add a little bit of white back in there. So what I'm going to do now is I'm actually going to move back over to my palette and mix up a paler shade of pink. So I'm just going to give my brush a little wash in my water. You can just dab it on your kitchen towel. I'm moving back over to my palette. I'm just going to start with some white as my base again, and this time I'm just going to add some pink. Give it a good mix. There I have a very, very pastel, pale baby pink. So taking this colour, I'm just going to do exactly the same thing again. I'm just going to paint it just on top of that last section, using that last section as our base, and then I'm going to paint this down a little bit as well. Again, I'm still just being quite choppy with my hand and my brush strokes. And then what I would say is once you've got most of the paint off your brush, you can then carefully, with a light touch, start adding swoops of it up into the previous sections of your sky. Just bring it down slightly as well so that this can act as our base for our next shade. So it's basically the same formula throughout the whole painting. Once you've painted that in, if you want to, you can do the same thing. You can pick up a little bit of this hot pink and add it into your sky. You can even, if you want to, pick up a little bit of the lilac colour and add little swoops of this into this section, just to tie everything in nicely. You can even pick up the smallest amount of pure purple, blend that in as well. Great thing about these colours is they work really lovely together, so they do just complement each other, so you can just add them on top. I like adding the white just because it gives it a little bit of highlight and almost suggests that there are clouds in the sky. And feel free to be quite thick with your paint as well if you want to. You don't have to overly blend it, like I've left it quite thick there and there. Again, don't forget to paint the sides as you go. So next I'm just going to paint this same pink colour down slightly. Again, this is going to act as our base for our next tone. So probably about ½ an inch here, depending on how big your canvas is. And then next up, I just want to mix my next colour. So I'm going to start by picking up some of this light pink that I've got and moving it over to a different dish. And all I'm going to do to this is add a tiny little bit of yellow. And I read a really small amount because this yellow is very pigmented and we just want to make a light peach shade. So just by adding the smallest amount of yellow, you just get that lovely warm peach tone within your paint. And taking this colour, we're going to do the same thing. So just paint it on top of that last section. You can add little bits of it up into the previous sections of the sky if you want to. And then you can start to bring it down as well. If you haven't got enough paint, I haven't probably mixed up enough, I'm just going to start again. So I'm going to start with some white, a little bit of pink, tiny bit of yellow, till you're happy, and then you can go ahead and use this. Starting to get to those nice sort of warm sunset shades now with this peach. And don't be afraid to just swipe it up into the other sections of the sky. Sometimes it's nice to see little elements. It gives it a bit of highlight, almost as though the sun's reflecting on parts of the clouds and the other areas of the sky. If ever in doubt and you're finding it really hard to blend, what I would do is just add the smallest amount of water to your brush, dab it off in your kitchen towel, and then go back in and just blend it out with that small amount of water on your brush. The water does really, really help with painting. You just want to make sure you haven't got too much on your brush. I would always say experiment with your paint, experiment with the water. You'll soon decide what you think works best for you. So once you've got that in there, you can then start doing the same thing. So I've just picked up a little bit of pure yellow I'm just going to start blending that in while the paint underneath is still nice and wet. And then if you want to, you could do the same with the pink again. Add little swipes of this in, blending it in with the paint underneath. And also, if you like the white element, you can add that back in as well. Just adding little touches of this pure yellow up into the higher sections of the sky while the paint is still damp underneath. Just blending it in. Once you're happy with that, we're now just going to move on to the last sort of shade for the bottom of our sky. So again, I'm just going to pick up some white as my base, move it over to a different dish. I'm going to add some pink back into it. I'm going to add a little bit more pink this time than I did the previous time, just to make it slightly brighter. And then again, I'm going to add a little bit of yellow to this to give it a slightly more orange tone. Again, just add the pink and the yellow really gradually so you can control the colour you're making. If you feel like you added too much of it, you could just add a little bit more white paint back into it, or just start again. I'm going to use this shade here, and I'm just going to bring it all the way down to the base of the canvas. Don't forget as well, you can paint the bottom of your canvas as well, so everything's nice and covered. And then just going to do the same thing. I'm just going to pick up a little bit of pure yellow on my brush and just add a few areas of this to the very base, just to really make it pop. And I might also do the same with a small amount of the pink as well. So we're almost mixing the colours on the canvas rather than on our palette. If ever you feel like your paint or your brush is getting dry, you can always just add a tiny bit of water to the bristles, dab it off, go back into your canvas, and it should just help it blend out nicely. And I'm just adding a few hints of these darker shades up into the other parts of the painting, just as though they're reflecting. Or even pick up a little bit more white and just add a little bit of this back in. Even going back up into that purple section and just adding a few little, almost just dusting the paint over the top just so it looks a little bit like wispy clouds. So just backwards and forwards, almost etching the paintbrush onto the canvas. And if you want to accentuate them even more, just pick up a tiny little bit of white and just go over some of the areas where you've just put this sort of peach tone, just to highlight them slightly. I haven't actually even really got much paint on my brush at all. I'm keeping the brush quite dry when I'm doing this, just so it looks a little bit more wispy. Just carry on until you're happy. Sometimes it's nice just to take a little step back, have a look at something else for a moment, and then come back and add anything else you want. Often with this, it's just about knowing when to stop because it's so relaxing. You can just carry on and on and on. But sometimes if you're happy, I would just say, pop down the paintbrush and leave it to dry. So just give your brush a good wash in your water. And then you can pop it down. So we just want to leave our background to dry for about 5 or 10 minutes before we move on to the foreground. Once your background is nice and dry, we can now move on to the foreground. So it's up to you what you want to add to the foreground. You might not want to have anything. What I'm going to do is just add little reeds, almost like wheatgrass, with some black paint, almost as though it's like a silhouette in the foreground and the sunset behind is the background. So for this, I'm just going to pick up my tiny brush and I just want to water down my black paint. The reason why we want to do this is we want the paint to be more of an ink-like consistency rather than too thick. It just helps us create these lovely, thin, crisp lines when it comes to painting in the grass or reeds or flowers, whatever you're wanting to add. So just keep adding the water and really mixing it in. You don't want it too drippy, but you do want to really thin out that paint. Making sure that you're giving it a good mix just means that the paint is still pigmented. The other trick that you can do before you move onto your canvas is just prepare your brush. You just want to make sure you're dabbing off any excess paint. You can almost twizzle the paintbrush and drag it down just so you can bring your paintbrush to a nice point. And remember, if ever you feel like your paint is getting sticky or dry, just add that water back in and then go ahead and use it. You just want to make sure that the paint here isn't too thick, because the thicker the paint, the thicker the lines are going to be. So as soon as you feel like you've prepared your paintbrush and the paint is nice and inky, we can now move back over to our canvas. Now, I know that this is the scary bit because we're essentially adding black paint to our canvas, but we're going to start nice and gradually just at the very, very bottom. And as a rule, if you are doing grass or reeds or cornflower or whatever you want to do, just always start from the base and then bring your hand up and almost lift off the top of the paintbrush. Now I feel like this is a little bit too thick because as you can see, the paint is like sort of separating a little bit on the canvas. So I'm just going to spend a moment now adding in more water, giving it a mix until I'm happy with the consistency. So as soon as you're happy, you can just start adding a few more of these reeds, always starting from the bottom. Just going to go over this one. and adding them going up. Sometimes I think as well, you don't want to work too slowly. You don't want to do like a slow line because then it makes it a little bit more wobbly. You want to make sure you're almost flicking the paintbrush up. It's also nice to have some that are slightly longer and some that are slightly shorter. Nice as well to have them sort of go off at different directions. Some might be slightly thicker than others. You can crisscross them. Just making sure that they look nice and natural. Again, just add that water back in as soon as you feel like you need to and really mix it in with the paint. You'll soon sort of get the knack of it, and you'll see that when the consistency of the paint is right, it makes it a lot easier to do a nice crisp thin line with it. Once you get the hang of it, if you want to, you can always go back in and make the very ends a little bit thinner. So it's just finding what's right for you, really. When I'm doing these longer ones, I like to start from the top down, but then for the smaller ones, I like to just almost flick the paintbrush up from the bottom. So just decide what you think's working for you. And remember that we are painting nature, so nothing needs to look neat. In fact, we don't want anything to look neat. You're going to get different sizes and shapes of grasses and reeds, so don't worry if they're not looking uniform. We really don't want them to. And as soon as you're ready, and if you want to, you can then just start adding a few little details on top of some of them. So I'm just going to start making the ends of some of these longer ones slightly thicker, just to show almost like the wheatgrass or some of the different flowers and plants that you would find in a field like this. So you might want to do actual flower petal shapes. You might want to do wheat. Totally up to you. Just making the tops just slightly thicker. Not on all of them, just on a select few. Some of these smaller ones might just be further in the distance, so the tops are just going to be a lot smaller. Just take a step back whenever you want to, have a little look, decide if there's any more you want to add. Once you're happy with your reeds, and as a last finishing touch, we can always add a couple of little birds flying in the distance. Now it's up to you if you want to do this with black paint or a different coloured paint, or if you want to do it with white paint. I think I'm going to go for some white paint, as if they're doves flying in the distance. So I'm just going to make sure I'm washing off my brush really well, just to get all of the black paint off the bristles. Once your brush is nice and clean, you can just go ahead and pick up a little bit of white paint or whichever colour paint you'd like to go for. And all I'm going to do is just paint in a couple of very small birds in the distance. So again, I'm just preparing my brush by getting rid of any of the excess paint. And all I'm going to do is find an area in my sky, and I'm just going to do 2 elongated M shapes. They're just going to be very, very subtle, flying in the distance.